The temperature was a sweltering 95 degrees Fahrenheit on that fateful day, the sun beating down relentlessly on the dry, cracked earth. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, the acrid tang of gunpowder hanging heavy over the battlefield. In the distance, the sound of artillery fire echoed through the valleys, the boom of cannons and the rattle of machine guns creating a deafening cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. As the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, 16th Regiment, emerged from the relative safety of the woods, they were greeted by a withering hail of gunfire. The enemy lines were clearly visible, a long line of trenches and bunkers stretching across the horizon, each one spewing forth a deadly torrent of lead and steel. The soldiers dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind any available obstacle, as they returned fire with their trusty M1 Garand rifles. The distinctive ping of the clip, ejecting from the rifle, a familiar sound to the seasoned veterans. To the left, a squad of soldiers armed with the Browning M19 19.30 caliber machine gun laid down a withering field of fire, the gun's familiar BRRRP, a comforting sound to the infantrymen as they advanced across the battlefield. The gun's crew, led by the grizzled Sergeant Thompson, worked with precision, carefully adjusting the gun's traverse and elevation to ensure maximum effect. The gun itself was mounted on a sturdy M2 tripod, its steel legs digging deep into T-earth as it recoiled gently with each burst of fire. As the soldiers pushed forward, they were supported by a pair of M4 Sherman tanks, their 75mm guns blazing away at the enemy positions. The tanks, call signs Blackjack 1 and Blackjack 2, were expertly crewed by seasoned veterans, their commander, Lieutenant Jameson, directing the fire with a keen eye for the enemy's weak points. The tanks' diesel engines roared as they advanced, their tracks crunching through the dry underbrush as they sought to outflank the enemy. To the right, a platoon of soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, descended onto the battlefield, their C-47 Dakota transport planes having dropped them squarely behind enemy lines. The paratroopers, armed with an assortment of M1 carbines, M1 Garands, and Thompson submachine guns, quickly regrouped and began to push forward, their objective to secure the key road junction at the foot of the hill. The paratroopers were a motley crew, their uniforms a mix of the standard-issue olive drab and the specialized jump gear, complete with reserve parachutes and first aid kits. As the battle raged on, the sounds of war filled the air, the screams of the wounded, the explosions of artillery fire, the rattle of small arms, and the rumble of the tanks. The earth itself seemed to shake beneath the feet of the soldiers, the ground trembling with each explosion. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear, the acrid tang of gunpowder hanging heavy over the battlefield like a miasma. In the midst of this chaos, a young private, Johnson, cowered behind a nearby boulder, his M1 Garand clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The private, barely out of his teens, had never seen combat before, and the sheer intensity of the battle was almost overwhelming. He peered around the boulder, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy, his heart racing with anticipation. Suddenly, a burst of machine gun fire ripped through the air, the bullets whizzing past his ear with a deadly whine. The private ducked back behind the boulder, his heart racing with fear. He glanced around, taking in the scene before him. To his left, a medic, Corporal Smith, tended to a wounded soldier, the soldier's leg torn open by a burst of shrapnel. The medic worked quickly, applying a tourniquet to stem the flow of blood, his face set in a grim mask of concentration. Nearby, a lieutenant, Lieutenant Wilson, yelled orders at the top of his lungs, directing his platoon with a series of crisp, sharp commands. The private, Johnson, took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He peered around the boulder once more, his eyes locking onto a nearby enemy bunker. The bunker, a sturdy concrete structure, was pouring forth a withering stream of gunfire, the bullets ripping through the air with deadly precision. The private knew that the bunker had to be taken out, and he steeled himself for the task ahead. As he prepared to make his move, the private's thoughts turned to his family, his parents and siblings back home. He wondered if he would ever see them again, if he would ever make it back to the safety of their farm. The private pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. He knew that he had to take out that bunker, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, the private launched himself from behind the boulder, his M1 Garand at the ready. He sprinted across the open ground, his heart pounding in his chest, the enemy gunfire ripping through the air around him. The private's world narrowed to a single point, the bunker looming ahead of him like a specter of death. He knew that he was running out of time. that the enemy would soon pinpoint his location and cut him down. The private's thoughts were a jumble of fear and adrenaline, his senses heightened as he sprinted across the battlefield. He could feel the ground beneath his feet, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots. He could hear the sound of his own ragged breathing, the pounding of his heart in his chest. The private's world was one of chaos and confusion, a maelstrom of noise and color that threatened to overwhelm him at any moment. And yet, despite the chaos, the private pressed on, driven by a fierce determination to complete his mission. He knew that the fate of the battle, perhaps even the fate of the war, hung in the balance. The private's actions, his bravery and selflessness, would be the deciding factor in the outcome of the battle. The private's thoughts were a jumble of fear and uncertainty, but he pressed on, undaunted, his spirit unbroken. As the battle commenced, the Allied forces, comprising of infantry, artillery, and cavalry units, initiated a multi-pronged assault on the enemy's defensive positions. The infantry, divided into 3 battalions, advanced in a staggered formation, with the 1st Battalion leading the charge. They moved in a slow and deliberate manner, maintaining a consistent pace of approximately 60 yards per minute, allowing them to conserve energy while still presenting a formidable front to the enemy. The 1st Battalion, comprising of 800 soldiers, formed the vanguard of the assault, with their rifles at the ready. They advanced in a series of short, sharp movements, darting between whatever cover they could find, be it rocks, trees, or folds in the terrain. As they moved forward, they laid down a withering field of fire, directing their shots at the enemy's fortified positions. The volleys of gunfire were carefully coordinated, with each company firing in succession, creating a continuous and unrelenting barrage that pinned down the enemy and prevented them from effectively returning fire. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion, consisting of 600 soldiers, moved to the flanks, attempting to outmaneuver the enemy and catch them off guard. They advanced in a wide, sweeping arc, utilizing the natural cover of the terrain to conceal their approach. As they moved, they maintained a continuous flow of communication, utilizing a complex system of hand signals and messengers to keep their commanders informed of their progress. The 3rd Battalion, comprising of 400 soldiers, brought up the rear, providing a reserve force that could be deployed as needed to reinforce the other 2 battalions or exploit any weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. They moved in a more leisurely pace, conserving their energy and maintaining a high level of alertness, ready to respond to any sudden developments on the battlefield. The artillery, positioned to the rear of the infantry, provided supporting fire, directing their guns at the enemy's fortified positions and attempting to weaken their defenses. The cannons, loaded with a combination of cannonballs and explosive shells, fired in a slow and deliberate manner, carefully aiming each shot to maximize its impact. The gunners, trained to perfection, worked in tandem, loading and firing their guns with a speed and efficiency that belied the complexity of their task. As the battle raged on, the cavalry, held in reserve, waited for the opportune moment to strike. Comprising of 300 horsemen, they were divided into 2 squadrons, each with a distinct role to play in the battle. The 1st squadron, consisting of heavy cavalry, was armed with lances and swords, and was tasked with breaking through the enemy's lines and creating chaos in their rear. The 2nd squadron, comprising of light cavalry, was armed with carbines and pistols, and was tasked with harassing the enemy's flanks and rear, disrupting their supply lines and communications. The cavalry, positioned on the extreme flanks of the battlefield, waited for the signal to charge. They sat atop their horses, their eyes fixed intently on the battlefield, watching as the infantry and artillery clashed with the enemy. As the battle reached its crescendo, the cavalry commander, a grizzled veteran with years of experience, raised his sword, and the cavalry surged forward, their horses thundering across the terrain as they charged into the fray. The charge was a masterclass in tactics, with the heavy cavalry leading the way. They formed a tight, wedge-shaped formation, with the most experienced horsemen at the front, and charged straight at the enemy's lines. The impact was tremendous, with the cavalry smashing into the enemy's defenses like a battering ram, creating a breach in the lines that the infantry could exploit. The light cavalry, meanwhile, swept around the flanks, firing their carbines and pistols as they went, and creating a diversion that drew the enemy's attention away from the main attack. They moved with a fluid, dynamic motion, utilizing their speed and agility to outmaneuver the enemy and catch them off guard. As the cavalry charged, the infantry and artillery continued to press the attack, pouring wave after wave of soldiers and firepower into the breach created by the cavalry. The enemy, reeling from the ferocity of the assault, stumbled backward, their defenses weakening as the Allies poured forward, exploiting the gaps in their lines and pushing deeper into their territory. The battle was far from over, however, as the enemy, despite being caught off guard, was far from defeated. They regrouped, reformed, and launched a series of fierce counterattacks, attempting to drive the Allies back and regain the initiative. The Allies, however, were prepared, and they met each counterattack with a fierce determination, fighting tooth and nail to hold their ground and maintain the momentum of their assault. As the battle raged on, the tide of the conflict ebbed and flowed, with each side trading blows and neither gaining the upper hand. The outcome was far from certain. As the Allies and the enemy clashed in a frenzy of steel and gunfire, each side determined to emerge victorious. The Allies, however, had one final trick up their sleeve, a secret plan that they had been holding in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The plan, conceived by the Allied commander, was a masterpiece of tactical genius, a complex and intricate web of maneuvers and feints that would catch the enemy off guard and deliver a crushing blow to their defenses. It was a plan that would require perfect timing, precise coordination, and a deep understanding of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The Allies, confident in their abilities and their plan, steeled themselves for the final push, ready to unleash their secret weapon and bring the battle to a triumphant conclusion. As the dawn broke on the horizon, the Allied forces, comprising of American, British, and Canadian troops, commenced their assault on the heavily fortified German positions. The artillery barrage, which had been relentless throughout the night, intensified in its ferocity, with the 105 mm howitzers and 155 mm guns unleashing a maelstrom of high-explosive shells upon the enemy lines. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the advancing infantry, as the cacophony of war echoed through the landscape, a chaotic symphony of screams, shouts, and the staccato bursts of machine gun fire. The Germans, entrenched behind their elaborate network of bunkers and trenches, returned fire with their MG-42 machine guns, the 7.92 mm bullets whizzing through the air with a deadly whine, cutting down any who dared to expose themselves. The Allied troops, clad in their M1941 field jackets and M1 helmets, pressed onward, their M1 Garand rifles at the ready, as they sought to overrun the enemy positions. The air was thick, with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite, the scent of sweat and fear hanging heavy over the battlefield. To the north, the British troops, supported by their Churchill tanks, pushed forward with a mix of caution and urgency, their Bren-light machine guns providing covering fire as they advanced. The Churchills, with their 75 mm QFMKV guns, blasted apart the German strongpoints, their ARMOR, withstanding the hail of Panzerfaust anti-tank projectiles and 88 mm flak gunfire. The Germans, however, refused to yield, their Panthers and Tigers, with their 75 mm KWK-42 and 88 mm KWK-36 guns, engaging the British armor in a fierce duel, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance. Meanwhile, to the south, the American forces, bolstered by their M4 Sherman tanks, made steady gains, their 76 mm M1A1 guns firing in support of the infantry as they inched their way forward. The Germans, nevertheless, put up a tenacious defense, their sniper teams and machine gun nests exacting a heavy toll on the advancing Americans. The M4 Shermans, with their 400 horsepower Continental R975 radial engines, churned forward, their tracks screeching in protest as they climbed over the rubble-strewn terrain, their .50 cal M2 Browning machine guns blazing away at any sign of enemy movement. The logistics of the battle were a marvel of modern warfare, with the Allies having amassed a vast array of supplies and equipment, from the thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel to the fleets of trucks and tanks that kept the war machine rolling. The Germans, on the other hand, were struggling to maintain their own logistical chain, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point, as the Allies sought to strangle their ability to wage war. The air support, provided by the Allied air forces, was a crucial factor in the battle, with the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs providing close air support, their .50 cal M2 Browning machine guns and 5-inch HVAR rockets blasting apart the German positions. As the battle raged on, the chaos and confusion reached a fever pitch, with the din of war growing louder by the minute. The cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, as the stretcher-bearers and medical teams rushed to evacuate the casualties, their faces set in grim determination. The smell of blood and smoke hung heavy over the battlefield, as the soldiers on both sides fought for their lives, their training and discipline put to the ultimate test. The outcome of the battle was far from certain, as the Allies and Germans clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire, their fate hanging precariously in the balance. In the midst of the chaos, a group of American soldiers, from the 101st Airborne Division, found themselves cut off from the rest of their unit, as they sought to take out a key German strongpoint. The soldiers, led by a grizzled sergeant, moved cautiously through the rubble-strewn streets, their M1 Garand rifles at the ready, as they sought to outmaneuver the enemy. The Germans, however, were on high alert, their machine gun teams and snipers waiting in ambush, as the Americans attempted to flank their positions. The sergeant, a veteran of the North African campaign, knew that the key to success lay in speed and surprise, as he led his team through the narrow streets, their eyes scanning the rooftops and doorways for any sign of enemy movement. The sold Mariers moved with a practiced ease, their senses heightened as they navigated the treacherous terrain, their lives hanging in the balance. The Germans, however, were not about to give up, as they launched a fierce counterattack, their tanks and infantry surging forward in a desperate bid to retake the lost ground. The battle was a complex web of tactics and strategy, with the Allies seeking to exploit the weaknesses in the German defenses, while the Germans fought to maintain their grip on the territory. The artillery, the air support, and the armor all played a crucial role in the battle, as the soldiers on both sides clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire. The outcome was far from certain, as the war machine raged on, fueled by the blood and sweat of the soldiers, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. The history books would later record the battle as a turning point in the war, a testament to the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought and died on that fateful day. The Germans, however, refused to yield, as they launched a series of fierce counterattacks, their tanks and infantry surging forward in a desperate bid to retake the lost ground. The Allies, nevertheless, stood firm, their lines holding against the enemy onslaught as they sought to grind down the German resistance. The battle was a war of attrition, with both sides trading blows, their strength and willpower being slowly drained away by the relentless pounding of the enemy. The soldiers on both sides were exhausted, their bodies worn down by the constant strain of battle, their minds numb from the constant barrage of noise and chaos. As the day wore on, the Allies began to gain the upper hand, their superior numbers and firepower slowly but surely grinding down the German resistance. The Germans, however, refused to surrender, as they fought on with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. The battle was a testament to the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers on both sides, as they clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. The outcome was far from certain, as the war machine raged on, fueled by the blood and sweat of the soldiers, their fate hanging in the balance. In the end, it was the Allies who emerged victorious, their superior numbers and firepower having finally worn down the German resistance. The battle was a crucial turning point in the war, as the Allies began their long and bloody push into the heart of Germany. The soldiers on both sides had fought with bravery and honor, their sacrifice and courage in the face of overwhelming odds a testament to the human spirit. The battle would be remembered for generations to come, a reminder of the devastating power of war and the sacrifice of those who fought and died in its name. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of utter devastation, with the landscape scarred and ravaged, the bodies of the dead and wounded strewn across the battlefield. The survivors, however, knew that they had achieved something special, something that would go down in history as a testament to their bravery and sacrifice. The battle was a defining moment in the war, a turning point that would ultimately lead to the defeat of Germany and the end of the war in Europe. As the sun began to set on the battlefield, casting a golden glow over the carnage, the intensity of the fighting reached a fever pitch. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and blood, a noxious mixture that hung heavy over the landscape like a miasma. The sound of gunfire and screams filled the air, a cacophony of chaos that seemed to have no end. The ground beneath the feet of the soldiers was slick with mud and blood, making every step a treacherous one, as if the very earth itself was conspiring against them. The troops on both sides were exhausted, their bodies racked with fatigue, their minds numbed from the constant barrage of artillery fire and the endless slaughter. Yet still they fought on, driven by a mixture of adrenaline, fear, and duty. The commanders on both sides, their faces set in grim determination, urged their men forward, exhorting them to make one final push, to break through the enemy's lines and emerge victorious. The battle was a complex web of maneuvers, an intricate dance of death, with each side trying to outflank and outmaneuver the other. The enemy's defenses were formidable, a labyrinth of trenches and bunkers, protected by layers of barbed wire. ND machine gun nests. But the attackers were undaunted, using every trick in the book to try and break through. From artillery bombardments to tank assaults, from infantry charges to aerial bombings. As the fighting raged on, the landscape itself began to change, transformed by the violence into a twisted, nightmarish realm. Craters pockmarked the earth, like gaping wounds that seemed to scream in agony. Trees were splintered and broken, their branches shattered, their trunks scarred and blackened. Buildings were reduced to rubble, their walls cracked and crumbling, their windows blown out, their roofs torn off. The soldiers on both sides were like automatons, their bodies driven by a fierce, primal energy, their minds numbed by the constant exposure to violence. They moved forward, step by step, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts pounding in their chests, their fingers tight around their rifles. They were no longer human beings, but rather extensions of their weapons, mere instruments of war, driven solely by the imperative to kill or be killed. In the midst of this chaos, individual acts of heroism and bravery stood out like beacons of light, shining brightly in the darkness. A soldier would charge forward, his rifle blazing, his body a blur of motion, as he tried to take out an enemy machine gun nest. A tank would lumber forward, its cannon firing, its tracks grinding, as it tried to break through the enemy's defenses. A pilot would dive down, his plane scream, his guns blazing, as he tried to strafe the enemy's positions. The enemy was just as determined, just as driven, just as willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of victory. They too had their heroes, their brave men and women who would stop at nothing to defend their homeland, their freedom, their way of life. They too had their acts of valor, their moments of sacrifice, their stories of courage and honor. As the battle raged on, the outcome hung in the balance, like a sword of Damocles, waiting to fall. The troops on both sides were evenly matched, their strengths and weaknesses canceling each other out, their advantages and disadvantages offsetting each other. It was a battle of attrition, a war of wills, with each side trying to wear the other down, to grind them into the dust, to emerge victorious through sheer force of numbers and determination. The commanders on both sides knew this, knew that the battle was far from won, that the outcome was still very much in doubt. They knew that one mistake, one miscalculation, could prove disastrous, could turn the tide of the battle against them. They knew that they had to be careful, had to be cautious, had to be prepared for every eventuality. And yet, despite these doubts and fears, despite the uncertainty and the chaos, the battle pressed on, driven by a momentum of its own, a tidal wave of violence and destruction that seemed to have no end. The soldiers on both sides were caught up in this maelstrom, swept along by the tide of war, unable to escape, unable to resist. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in a dark, eerie gloom, the fighting showed no signs of letting up. The troops on both sides were like gladiators, locked in a mortal combat, each one determined to emerge victorious, each one willing to do whatever it took to win. The battle was a spectacle, a gruesome, brutal, and captivating display of human ferocity, a testament to the enduring power of violence and the indomitable will to survive. In this vortex of chaos, individual soldiers were reduced to mere statistics, their lives mere blips on the radar of war. They were faceless, nameless, anonymous, their identities lost in the sea of humanity, their stories drowned out by the cacophony of gunfire and screams. And yet, despite this, despite the anonymity and the chaos, each one of them was a unique, precious, and irreplaceable human being, with their own hopes and fears, their own dreams and desires. As the night wore on, the battle showed no signs of abating, the fighting continuing with unabated ferocity, the violence and the chaos swirling around like a maelstrom, sucking everything in its path down into the depths of hell. The soldiers on both sides were trapped in this whirlpool, unable to escape, unable to resist, their lives reduced to a mere struggle for survival, their existence narrowed down to a single, primal imperative: to kill or be killed. The once proud city lay in ruins, streets now a haunting testament to the devastating power of war. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and the acrid smell of burning flesh, a constant reminder of the horrors that had unfolded. As the dust settled, the survivors emerged, shell-shocked and bewildered, to survey the carnage that surrounded them. Everywhere, the cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, a poignant reminder of the catastrophic consequences of conflict. Casualty reports began to trickle in, each one a stark reminder of the human cost of the war. The numbers were staggering, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians alike caught in the crossfire. The medical teams worked tirelessly, their faces etched with exhaustion, as they struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the disaster. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, with makeshift facilities springing up in schools, community centers, and even abandoned buildings. The scenes within these improvised hospitals were nothing short of chaotic, with doctors and nurses working around the clock to tend to the endless stream of wounded. Among the survivors, individual stories of resilience and courage began to emerge. There was Maria, a young mother who had lost her husband in the initial bombing raid. Despite her grief, she had managed to find shelter in a nearby basement, where she had spent the entire ordeal huddled with her 2 children, praying for the dawn to come. As the family emerged into the bright sunlight, they were met with a scene of utter devastation. Their home, their neighborhood, and their entire community had been reduced to rubble. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming loss, Maria found the strength to comfort her children, to reassure them that they would rebuild, that they would survive. Then there was Jake, a young soldier who had been caught in the crossfire during the final battle. He had been left for dead, his body riddled with shrapnel, but somehow, against all odds, he had managed to crawl to safety. As he lay in his hospital bed, his body racked with pain, he couldn't help but think of his comrades, his friends, who had not been so fortunate. The memories of that fateful day would haunt him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the horrors of war. Despite the trauma he had endured, Jake was determined to rebuild, to find a way to honor the memories of those who had fallen. As the days turned into weeks, the city began to stir, slowly, tentatively. The survivors, fueled by a mix of grief, anger, and determination, began the long, arduous process of rebuilding. They worked tirelessly, clearing rubble, repairing damaged infrastructure, and slowly, incrementally, restoring a sense of normalcy to their shattered lives. It was a daunting task, one that would take years, if not decades, to complete. But they were driven by a shared sense of purpose, a determination to create a better future, one that would honor the memories of those who had been lost. The international community, shocked by the scale of the devastation, rallied to provide aid, sending in teams of experts, food, medicine, and equipment to help alleviate the suffering. The response was overwhelming, with donations pouring in from around the world. Yet, even as the city began to receive the help it so desperately needed, the survivors knew that the road ahead would be long, difficult, and fraught with challenges. They had lost so much, suffered so greatly, and the scars of war would take a long time to heal. In the midst of this devastation, there were moments of hope, of resilience, of defiance. A group of volunteers, led by a young woman named Sophia, had established a makeshift school where children could come to learn, to play, and to forget, if only for a few hours, the trauma they had endured. It was a small act of defiance, a declaration that even in the darkest of times, there was still a place for joy, for laughter, and for learning. As the children sat in their makeshift classroom, their faces lit up with smiles, their eyes sparkling with curiosity, it was clear that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human spirit could persevere. The city's leaders, too, began to emerge, their faces etched with determination, as they vowed to rebuild, to restore, and to renew. They faced a daunting task, one that would require courage, vision, and a deep commitment to the well-being of their people. But they were driven by a sense of purpose, a sense of duty, deep-seated determination to create a better future, one that would be worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. As they surveyed the ruins of their city, they knew that the road ahead would be long, difficult, and fraught with challenges, but they were undaunted, for they knew that they were not alone. They had the support of their people, the aid of the international community, and, above all, the resilience of the human spirit. In the end, it was this spirit, this capacity for hope, for resilience, and for defiance, that would ultimately define the city's response to the devastation it had suffered. Even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the survivors had found a way to persevere, to rebuild, and to create a new future, one that would be brighter, stronger, and more resilient than ever before. As the city slowly, tentatively, began to rise from the ashes, it was clear that the true test of its mettle was only just beginning. The road ahead would be long, difficult, and fraught with challenges, but the survivors were ready, for they had already endured the unimaginable, and had emerged, scarred but unbroken. As we conclude our comprehensive examination of the military conflict, it is imperative to delve into the long-term geopolitical implications that have manifested in the aftermath. The reverberations of this conflict have been felt across the globe, influencing the trajectory of international relations, global governance, and the balance of power among nations. The conflict has led to a significant shift in the global geopolitical landscape, with erstwhile alliances being reevaluated and new partnerships being forged. The rise of emerging powers has been accelerated, as they have sought to capitalize on the power vacuum created by the conflict. This has resulted in a multipolar world, where various nations are jostling for influence and dominance. One of the most significant consequences of the conflict has been the erosion of trust among nations. The violation of international norms and the disregard for human rights have created an environment of mistrust and skepticism. This has hindered the ability of nations to collaborate on issues of common concern, such as climate change, pandemics, and economic development. The conflict has also had a profound impact on the global economy. The disruption of trade routes, the destruction of infrastructure, and the displacement of people have all contributed to economic instability and stagnation. The rise of protectionism and nationalism has further exacerbated the situation, as nations have sought to shield their economies from the perceived threats of globalization. Furthermore, the conflict has led to a significant increase in military spending, as nations have sought to bolster their defense capabilities in response to the perceived threats. This has resulted in a diversion of resources away from critical sectors, such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure development. Opportunity cost of this expenditure has been significant, as nations have foregone the opportunity to invest in the well-being and prosperity of their citizens. In addition, the conflict has had a profound impact on the environment. The destruction of natural habitats, the pollution of water sources, and the release of greenhouse gases have all contributed to environmental degradation. The long-term consequences of this damage will be felt for generations to come, as the planet struggles to recover from the ravages of war. As we reflect on the legacy of this conflict, it is clear that the consequences will be far-reaching and profound. The impact on global governance, international relations, and the balance of power will be felt for decades to come. The rise of new global challenges, such as pandemics, climate change, and cybersecurity threats, will require a concerted effort from nations to address. In conclusion, the legacy of this conflict serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of war. The impact on human lives, the environment, and the global economy has been catastrophic. As we move forward, it is imperative that nations learn from the mistakes of the past and work towards a more peaceful and cooperative future. As the great philosopher Immanuel Kant once said, "Perpetual peace is a dream, and not even a pleasant one, for it would lead to stagnation and the cessation of progress. However, it is a dream that we must strive for, as the alternative is a world plagued by conflict, destruction, and chaos." As we strive for a more peaceful and harmonious world, we must recognize that the journey will be long and arduous, but the rewards will be immeasurable. As we conclude this series, I would like to thank you for joining me on this journey through the complexities of military history. If you have found this series informative and engaging, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we will continue to explore the intricacies of military history and its impact on the world. By subscribing, you will gain access to a wealth of knowledge and insight into the most significant conflicts of the past and how they have shaped the world we live in today. So please, take a moment to subscribe and join us on this ongoing exploration of the fascinating and complex world of military history.